because I'm holding out for more American and British intervention, quote unquote, like in Bosnia. So once again, we have a war perpetuated and civilians suffering exacerbated by the prospect of intervention. So what should we do about this? And I have two sets of prescriptions. The first addresses the, I'm going to skip through this. The first addresses the speed of intervention, and if we're serious about saving civilians, we have to get there faster. We have to have lighter forces, which means we suffer more more casualties, a trade-off that we discussed yesterday. Secondly, we should pre-position forces close to where these types of crises usually occur, which is in Africa. We could speed up, sometimes by an order of magnitude, how quickly we can get there if we pre-position the heavier forces over there. But probably intellectually more interesting set of recommendations are those which try to address this moral hazard problem. And the first and the most important is that we should not intervene on humanitarian grounds in ways that benefit rebels unless state retaliation is grossly disproportionate. Okay, what does that mean? That means that if there is a rebellion and the state is mainly targeting the rebels, yes, killing some civilians as collateral damage, but mainly targeting the rebels, we should not intervene. Okay? What's disproportionate retaliation? Disproportionate retaliation would be if there's a rebellion and the government retaliates by trying to kill all the civilians. That's disproportionate. Or if it's a peaceful protest movement and the government decides it's going to suppress that by persistently killing civilians. That would be disproportionate. But counterinsurgency against a rebellion is not disproportionate. I have what, 2 minutes? About? Something like that.
Correct.
Okay. So the others are that we should deliver aid, humanitarian aid to civilians in ways that don't inadvertently help rebels. We should, rather than intervening on behalf of rebels, we should intervene on behalf of peaceful protest movements. And when I say intervene, I mean not just military intervention. That's one of the slides that I skipped. Intervention means anything that we do that's intended to help civilians, and that can be economic and sanctions or aid, things like that. Essentially to persuade governments, rather than intervening against states that are defending themselves from rebels, let's incentivize states to be nicer to groups that are protesting peacefully. If we're going to coerce regime change or surrender of sovereignty, we should only do so if we take precautions against the likely backlash. And the backlash is very common. It happened in Bosnia, Rwanda, Kosovo, East Timor. If you say to a government, we're going to remove you from office, or we're going to take part of your territory and give it to someone else, they will usually do almost anything to prevent that, including massacring civilians. So we should be aware of that ahead of time, and we should only do that if we take precautions. And those are, for example, golden parachutes. I'll talk about that in a sec. Power sharing, or preventive military intervention so that we're on the ground to protect the civilians before the backlash occurs. And then lastly, we should not falsely claim that we're intervening on humanitarian grounds when we're really intervening for other reasons. Otherwise, we exacerbate this moral hazard problem. Groups around the world say, look, they're intervening again on humanitarian grounds. Let's just start a fire. They'll come in, put it out, and help us. So let's apply that to Libya, which is what I tried to do in a piece published a couple weeks ago. And it was nice. I could take my 5 things from my academic work and put it into a paper that showed up for free on my doorstep today, USA Today. And so applying this to Libya, sorry for the eye chart. This is just sort of a cut and paste from the op-ed. Don't intervene unless Gaddafi's forces are deliberately massacring civilians. I don't believe that that's occurring. I was talking with a colleague this morning, and he said, and I agree, and I have another piece hopefully going to come out soon, that said there was not going to be a bloodbath in Benghazi. What was there going to be? It was going to be a defeat of the rebels in Benghazi. So the rebels concocted this notion that there was going to be a bloodbath, but there wasn't. we would have pictures. We would have people lined up and shot. This is the day of cell phones. This is the day of everything is on cell phone cameras and videos. We don't see those pictures. We should police the relief sites so that they don't become rebel bases. We should increase pressure on the governments that are killing nonviolent protesters, not the governments that are killing rebels. If we demand Gaddafi's departure, we should arrange asylum for him, and we should arrange that some of his subordinates continue in power. Otherwise, I believe these folks will do anything to retain power, and that includes actually starting to commit genocide, which they're not right now. And lastly, if President Obama intervened not because of humanitarian concern, but just because Gaddafi's a bad guy, and he's done bad things in the past, and he killed 2 US soldiers in a discotheque in West Berlin 25 years ago, then he should say that's why he's intervening. Otherwise, it's going to give the impression, as he has, that we're intervening on humanitarian grounds, and that increases the moral hazard problem. So I just want to say one last thing to conclude, and that is that the debate about intervention is caricatured. It's caricatured as a simplistic policy dispute between humanitarians on the one side and cold-hearted realpolitik types on the other side. And you know, that debate does exist, but it's not the only debate, right? It's not as if Samantha Power cares about protecting civilians, but Alan Cooperman doesn't care about protecting civilians. There's a prior question, and that is which humanitarian strategies actually work and which strategies backfire by killing more innocents. Now, I'm in a room of people who know a lot more about ethics, morality, and political philosophy than I do, but I was taught as an undergrad about Weber's distinction between the ethic of conviction and the ethic of responsibility. And we really, I think, need to take that seriously. Samantha Power advocated intervention, persuaded President Obama to intervene in Libya on grounds that we shouldn't stand aside while civilians are suffering. I opposed intervening in ways that would get more civilians killed. So my question is, which of us, Samantha or I, really cares more about protecting non-combatants? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cooperman. We turn finally to a question of whether the private sector can carry out intervention with a flexible force on the ground more efficiently than can conventional national militaries. And to handle that question, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Dean Peter Baker, who's now Assistant Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law here at the Naval Academy, but has been for many years Associate Professor of Ethics in the School of Philosophy and Ethics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, where he taught for 11 years. He is a member here of the Naval Academy's Africa Forum and Irregular Warfare Working Group, and was in South Africa director of the University of KwaZulu-Natal Strategic Studies Group. He retired from the South African Army Reserve in 2009 with the rank of major and served as the convener of the South Africa Army Future Vision Research Group and part of the leader group of the Umvoti Mounted Rifles, a reserve armored cavalry regiment. He's a specialist in both epistemology and the ethics of armed conflict, and carries out research in fields of philosophy, ethics, and security studies. He's recently authored an essay on on the use of private military contractors in a book edited by our colleague Paolo Tripodi and Jessica Wolfendale. It's just out, called New Wars and New Soldiers, on the moral dilemmas of irregular warfare, including humanitarian intervention, but not limited to that. And he himself has just published a book called Just Warriors, Inc., The Ethics of Privatized Force. Professor Baker.
Thank you. I'm going to try and get through this as quickly as possible so that we have time for discussion. So I'll hold off on all the thanks, but I'm very grateful to be here, particularly in such an august body. I also published an op-ed recently. I'm very pleased about that because that never happens to me. And I argued in that the United States that one way for the United States to avoid a potential stalemate and a chronic conflict in Libya would be to provide the means necessary for the rebels to secure the services of private companies that could supply the necessary expertise and logistical support to turn the rebel rabble into a genuine fighting force. You probably won't be surprised to hear me say that I didn't really expect that the administration would jump on this with glee and rush out and contract with Blackwater. I'm aware enough of the kind of standard norms in our society that are opposed to the use of contractors in anything more than a kind of a limited supporting role. And I think that's probably going to continue for some time. But I take it that it is the role of philosophers to say outrageous things, some of which may turn out to be true. And so that's what I'm going to do over the next 20 minutes or so. In order to give my comments some coherence and structure, what I'm going to do is piggyback loosely on the structure of James Patterson's analysis in his book entitled Humanitarian Intervention and the Responsibility to Protect Who Should Intervene. And that's my focus on the who question. And in using James in this way, I don't mean to suggest he's got everything right. I think it's a great book. But his is the most expansive analysis of this issue that I know of. And so it gives me quite a lot of useful conceptual space for my own position. I do have slides. They're mainly just pictures so that you've got something to look at other than me. So there's my first point, contracted combatants and local external effectiveness. Patterson argues that the primary and only necessary criterion for legitimate humanitarian intervention is the consequentialist consideration of the likely effectiveness of the intervention, what he calls local external effectiveness. And the first and most obvious of the qualities necessary for effectiveness in a humanitarian intervention is the possession of the necessary military resources, including appropriately trained and motivated personnel, equipment such as vehicles and weapons, and strategic lift capability. None of these considerations, I believe, represent a barrier to employing contractors for humanitarian interventions. If screening and selection mechanisms are rigorously applied, then there's no reason in principle why appropriate personnel could not be found to take on the task at hand. As Mark Kansian has argued, contracted combatants employed in Iraq and Afghanistan have shown themselves to be, in general, highly professional. In fact, the private sector has a particular advantage over more traditional military forces when it comes to selecting personnel for humanitarian interventions. The military usually considers which of its formed units that are available at the time are the best fit for the task at hand. Often, given other commitments, there's very little choice in the matter, and the unit or units deployed may not be especially well suited to the particularities of the operational environment. The private sector, on the other hand, recruits contractors for the specific mission being undertaken, which gives a significantly greater degree of flexibility and fit to purpose in recruiting. Equipment and strategic lift, I argue, strategic lift capability are also not a particular problem. Very few states maintain significant in-house equipment manufacturing capabilities these days, and so the vast majority of military equipment of all kinds is produced by and is in theory available from the private sector. Other direct qualities of an effective intervener include the intervener having an appropriate strategy for achieving the goals of the intervention and the political will to make full use of the resources available for the intervention. And in one sense, this is kind of irrelevant to whether or not you use contractors. It's a question that depends on who's sending them in the first place. Nonetheless, there are some important points to be made here. First, it's worth noting that if the strategic planning for the mission is left in the hands of the contracted force, it needn't be, but if it is, there is no reason in principle why the strategy that emerges should be any less suitable for the mission than if it were drawn up by state military planners. Indeed, in the US in particular, the military depends quite heavily on contractors from firms like MPRI and others to run simulations and exercises and to help prepare campaign plans. That happens a lot. Private military companies also offer significant potential advantage over state military forces when it comes to the cultural expertise that is often necessary to succeed in complex humanitarian operations. For one thing, economic considerations generally push them to employ local personnel wherever possible, with a consequent gain in local knowledge, as well as a reduction in the intervention's overall footprint in the local cultural environment. Furthermore, because contracted combatants and other contractors are recruited for specific operations rather than being a standing force, there is far greater opportunity to recruit personnel with relevant cultural and language skills. Another important factor is the likely impact that employing a contracted combatant force for an intervention will have on what Patterson calls internal effectiveness. That is, the impact of the intervention on the intervening nation's own population. If it is true that a contracted combatant force would represent a less costly means of undertaking an intervention, then such a force is, relative to the financial savings involved, less likely